Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Collins. I oversee research ethics here at the New School, or the Human Subjects Protection Program, otherwise known as Institutional Review Board, and a couple other things here. So today I'm just going to give a high-level overview of how to get research approval here at the New School, talking about the general process, sort of the regulatory framework we look at, what research we review in-house, and what research we send out to Brainy. So I just titled the presentation today, just Research with Integrity, Understanding the IRB Process of the New School, to try to demystify some of the myths here. And I should start out by saying, too, that I don't come from a background where, I mean, I have seen this at other schools where, the IRB is the research police. I see myself as a collaborative person, and maybe some of the answers are yes, but generally the principle of kind of yes and how could we figure out a way to make this work for you. So I always say there's really no problem that's too big and no problem that's too small. No question that's too easy to answer, because a lot of times these things are very, very nuanced, and what may apply to one research project is completely different on another research project. So I'm going to try to handle some of this stuff from a real high level process, but realizing too that there is some distinctions between the differences in the social sciences, and are the social sciences compared to Parsons, psychology compared to anthropology and sociology. So there's a lot of nuances in there, but that would be a separate presentation. Okay, so what is the goal of our program here at the New School? It's really to make sure we're ensuring the welfare and dignity of our human subjects. That really just means, in other words, fulfilling our responsibility as a social justice institution, to ensure we're complying with federal research guidelines and also state research guidelines, and just, ethics in general. I think a lot of times the regulations, they are what they are, and they certainly were written with a certain purpose to ensure that there is a certain threshold of ethical guidelines across the United States. But I think really, when I think a lot about research projects that take place at New School, yes, there's a lot of regulatory stuff we're looking at or thinking through when we're thinking about this. But a lot of it is just, really comes down to the end of the day, this 51-49 balancing act of kind of what looks a little better than not. And that's easier said than done. Sometimes, or easier said from my perspective, as helping researchers get through the process. So the second thing is assist researchers in conducting ethical research. My office and myself serve as sort of going out there and doing a lot of presentations like this for classes, for working with individual students and faculty. We can work with some staff on projects, pretty much just basically helping to educate the community. And third one, kind of what I said in the first one, just support the social justice and ESIJ principles of the New School, since that's what our heart and soul of our philosophy of the New School is. Okay, so I always like to draw a distinction between doing research on humans and animals. And the thing that's made my life easier in now a post-COVID world is I think I think most people have a better understanding of kind of clinical research, just from on the very basic level, from the COVID vaccinations that came out. And so generally speaking, this is a very high-level overview here too, and I will admit these are my two dogs, Cookie and Mojo, and Cookie just had his birthday yesterday. He is 15, and I always like to draw the distinction that it's much harder to do research on animals. And why is that? It comes down to the basic principle in research and research ethics that obtaining consent is first and foremost the most important thing in the process. So therefore, as we know, well, probably my two Maltepues would probably disagree, animals are unable to consent. And so it's a much more difficult process to do research on animals because they can't consent. Though, again, like everything when we're thinking about research, the reason why we use animals to test, for example, to test medications, and both for animals and for, in a veterinary context and also for humans is always based on this kind of 51-49 balancing act, which I will mention over and over again, is kind of how do we figure out a way in which we can test new things coming onto market to make sure they're going to benefit the most amount of people and mitigate harm. What was interesting about the rollout of the COVID vaccinations is that they were pushed very quickly into the market because of the need at the time. We needed to solve, so many people had come down with COVID, whatever it was, millions of people at that point, and we needed to figure out a way to solve it. Normally, the process for getting drugs approved is a multi-year, consisting of multiple levels of clinical trials, sometimes on people, sometimes on animals, sometimes on both. It takes years to go through, and which is one of the challenges I think we deal with, which is real contrary to the social behavior, social sciences, is that drugs can, I mean, they're not joking when they say, or exaggerating, they can take millions of dollars to be able to fund a new drug coming to market, and it takes many years. Even in doing that, the different steps, we have to figure out that, is it going to do more good than more harm? And I think to use that analogy in kind of the same way we think about the social sciences, it's much easier to do research on people than it is humans. I'm sorry, on humans than it is animals for that very purpose. And especially in the social sciences, there isn't that sort of great dichotomy as there is in biomedical world, where there could be, in most cases, there is likely true harm to the participants, especially if we don't disclose what the possible side effects are. So when we participate in clinical trials, which I think are wonderful and great, especially for things that we need novel therapies for, we always have to recognize that, like anything in life, stepping outside, for example, we're constantly balancing, the risks versus the benefits in that, and so that is really the cornerstone of social behavioral science, social behavioral research, is making sure that we do that then in an ethical way, and we're not taking advantage of our human participants. So, how did we get here? Without going into too much detail here, there were many notorious research events that happened in human history, from the Tuskegee experiments, the Nazi experiments, Milgram experiments. There was the Stanford Prisoner experiment, which is actually an excellent movie. I believe it's still on Netflix, that really gives a good overview of kind of research that's all gone wrong. Most of the research that's kind of gone wrong over the years happened to be in psych and medicine, but the Stanford Prisoner experiment, I call that more in sociology. But the one common prevailing things among all of these was the research was not transparent. People were not told up front with the risk benefit analysis or what the risks were to the study. Consent was not properly obtained, and there was true harm to the participants. So basically, all these events in human history led to the need for an ethics code. Um, and our basic framework for the ethics code originated out of all these disastrous things that happened in the 40s, 50s. I think it's more like the stuff that went wrong more in the 60s and 70s, and Stanford Prisoner experiment was in there. The Milgram experiment was in the 60s. The Tuskegee experiment lasted for 40 years, from the 30s to the 70s. So Congress got together and created something called the Belmont Report, which basically provides the basic principles for how we evaluate and determine the risk benefit analysis of social behavioral research. And so it's basically based on three principles. First of all, respect for persons. You're going to hear me say this over and over again, but the issue of consent is really important. And it's really also important to be transparent with the participants and writing it in a language and also level that is for them to understand. Easy enough for them to understand. I would say our basic consent forms assume about a 10th grade, I'd say 10th, 11th grade reading comprehension level. But if you're working with participants that are going to be at a lower reading level, as I was talking to one scholar earlier today, who's going to be working with some indigenous people in some South American countries, I'm not sure we can assume a 10th grade reading level is going to be adequate for that population. I was thinking, based on my knowledge of that, we were talking, it's probably more like a sixth grade level. And so adapting that consent form, well, you have to use the template, but then adapting the consent form, using that as a starting point to bring it down to people who are participating at that level and is so important. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later, but really consent is everything. And it's not just handing people a consent form, it's actually being able to verbally explain it to them too. And for the person to walk away and say, I understood what, at least on the very basic level, what happened with this, what the purpose of the study was, and kind of understand, based on the questions, you may or may not. I've participated in a lot of research studies where I really didn't have any idea where they were going with the study. With other ones, it was very clear. But providing that consent form, also emailing it to them now these days, or providing it in an electronic form. So I like to say that you go home and have dinner at 6 o'clock with your family. Everybody's going around how their day was. You can say, yeah, I participated in this study today. It was on X, Y, and Z. They asked me these questions and that. But, at the end, like, then someone, one of the other people at the table asks a follow-up question, and like, I'm not really sure exactly what it was totally about. But, and I like to say now these days, it used to be hard copy, but you could just take out your phone and be like, yeah, they gave me this consent form. And generally consent forms are just a couple pages long, sometimes maybe 1 or 2 page if it's a more basic study, and they can, and one of the earlier sections will say exactly what the study's about, and it's an easy reminder. So consent to participate is so important in both in terms of getting verbal consent, but also giving them an actual written consent form. Beneficence. This is really important as a result of some of the studies that went wrong, and just making sure the risks of the research are justified by the potential benefits. And what we mean by this is that like I always say, there's sort of this 51-49 balancing act. And a lot of things in my world, I say, are extremely gray. And so we're kind of on this gray spectrum of one being the grayest to 10 being, I'm sorry, one being the least grayest to the 10 being the grayest, in that process. And it's really difficult to figure out. I think the reason why I talk about biomedical research, as I did a couple slides ago, is that it's pretty clear in biomedical research that there are some risks to the participants. If you're participating in a clinical trial, there is a potential risk to you whether you get the placebo. I mean, if you get the placebo, then you're not going to, and probably nothing's going to happen. But if you actually get the intervention, there is a great possibility that by participating in that, you may be solving one thing, but harming, your body has a reaction to something else. So that's clear. We know that in biomedical research. There's clear, well, clear is always a kind of an ambiguous term, but generally, we know what the risks are. In social behavioral research, it's a little bit different. In some cases, there really are true risks to participants, which I'll talk about a little later, and those are oftentimes in contextual basis. Now, whether those risks are ever going to reach fruition, I tend to think the risk of where we're going these days is more shifted to data breaches than something like the Milgram experiments or the Stanford prisoner experiment. I don't perceive that as people really getting hurt from an intervention, though it's possible. And certainly I've seen cases even here at New School where we could certainly say that's more plausible than not, or there's a certain amount of plausibility. But I really think the risk now we're looking at these days is just data. Data getting out, a data breach, stuff getting on the internet, social media, so on and so forth. And so that's a real concern. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, of kind of how that is kind of the 2026 version of this as opposed to 1978 version, which was a totally different world. And then justice, just equal distribution of risk benefits among all. So you're not harming one population to be able to help another population. And I often get this question asked to me actually of whether, for example, well, Kevin, I'm going to be looking at X population. Maybe it's female students who are underrepresented minorities in a K-12 school. And I only want to work with and understand their experiences. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is sampling a certain population to meet your goal for the study. What would be kind controversial or probably unethical research would be if you had an intervention and one group, maybe that group was favored over fill in the blank other group, the representation of the school, that we would see as a potential issue there because one group is being impacted favorably and the other group is being impacted negatively, only to study it for social behavioral research purposes. So moving on, this is another thing I think gets a little tripped up by people too in terms of, and I'm going to talk I'll talk about in a few minutes sort of how the regulatory review process works. But I have this conversation with people all the time, especially across disciplines, and because the New School is such a diverse institution, from Parsons being mostly designed with some infiltration of social behavioral methods and research, all the way over to like anthropology and psych, which is certainly on the other end of this. This question comes up a lot: is Kevin, I'm doing research with people. I'm actually interviewing or surveying them. Why does my study meet the definition of research? And sometimes it doesn't meet the definition of research. In both cases, it's research. And I always like to point that out that 99% of the people that are coming to my office are doing research. It just research is in my world is sort of has a different definition than what normally we would describe in other contexts. So the federal definition of research really looks at whether the living individual whom the investigator is looking at is data through intervention and interaction with the individuals, and it's identifiable private information. And really what that means is we can get around, you can still do research with people, and it still may or may not meet this federal definition. And I think what the challenge is here, especially when we're doing action research or life history research or oral histories, is that in qualitative research, while the data you're collecting is not necessarily generalizable beyond that context, it's still generalizable knowledge. It's one snapshot in time with one group. And so the definition above is systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, evaluation, design to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge, is sort of something we get tripped up on because it's really easy in quantitative research to contribute to generalizable knowledge, but more difficult in qualitative research. As I said, it's one snapshot in time. So how does this sort of break? As I just mentioned a second ago, we're pretty liberal here at the New School, and the idea is we're always trying to figure out ways to be the least regulatory as possible. So whatever studies we can do in-house, which are those that don't meet the federal definition of research, commonly oral histories, life histories, action research, research that is on process improvement, we can pass those along. Generally speaking, those are the four big categories. I would say also most of the research in Parsons would not meet this definition. For example, there was a student the other day who came to me who was doing observations in a high-end retailer and just looking at people's shopping patterns. Yeah, that's about people, but that's just a process improvement project from the way I look at it. So that doesn't meet the federal definition of research. Whereas on the opposite end, someone in psych who's looking at, people who suffer from depression or a psychiatric condition, and they're, how they, let's make it simple for that. They're, looking at how they handle that. That's definitely research in that context. Okay, so let me continue here along. So we think about IRB submissions. One of the things I know, because there's a number of people here who come to me who have been at New School for a long time, and remember when it was important to the regulatory context of how your submission was, the regulatory research category was really important. And now we've kind of reversed that process in the last couple of years. There's really two paths, as I mentioned. There's what's called not research, meaning it's more process improvement stuff, but we just look at things as more not human subject research. That stuff stays in-house. Now with moving to Brainy, Brainy does not treat applications that are any different in terms of the questions they're asking, from exempt, which is no research, to expedited some research, and full board greater than minimal risk. So it's the same application, same questions. Based upon the topic, we have to fit it in one of these three categories above, or one of these five categories overall. With Brainy doing the top three, it's less important, I think, at the end of the day, what your study is categorized, because if it has to go to Brainy, it has to go to Brainy. More of the issue is just whether it's mandated that you submit a continuing review every year. And the way Brainy works is, because we need to have a understanding of kind of what research is still going on out there. Brainy does ask for a regular check-in every year just to find out what's going on. That's not required by the federal regulations for most projects. It's really a simple 2-minute, like, where are you? Do you need another year of an extension? What's going on? Did anything happen? And really can be done in 2 minutes. So the regulatory burden of kind of those yearly check-ins is really more for us just to know where our research portfolio is and who's still doing research out there. But I get a lot of questions sometimes, and people will come to me and say, "Oh, my study's exempt. It should not be. I do not need IRB approval." And I want to be really clear here, both exempt and expedited are regulatory review categories. It doesn't mean that your study is going to go through quicker because it's exempt. You still have to fill out all the same forms. It's the same application. You need consent forms. You need to see your surveys, entries, focus group questions, whatever it is you're asking. And expedited doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be expedited either. So the unfortunate thing is that the federal guideline, the federal regulators came up with these definitions, which are, like everything I feel like in research, sort of relative and don't really mean what they are, what you look at them to be on the surface. So I like to tell people, the way we have set things up now at the new school, it's less important to understand where your study falls here, and more to understand, do I need to go to Brainy, which is most cases you do. Probably about 90% of the cases we get do go to Brainy, but there's other studies that can fall into that not human subject and not research lens from that perspective, or regulatory guidelines. So there's two types of vulnerable populations. We'll talk about, so I'm going to spend a second here to talk about vulnerable populations that are outlined in the federal regulations. These are populations that no matter what, we are, as an IRB at either New School or Brainy or any really IRB out there, has to give more attention to, because they are designated in the federal guidelines. So pretty obvious. Obviously you'd want to give pregnant women and fetuses more consideration. Prisoners, that's a whole ball of wax in terms of dealing with that population and working with them. And really, I think prisoners is the best example of people and children who really can't consent, because they're not, prisoners obviously don't have the same freedoms other people do in society. And so there's a lot of issues there with coercion and so on and so forth. And so they're a good example of people who can't really give consent. Doing research with prisoners is challenging because it also comes down to the definition too, is what is a prisoner. I'm not going to get into that, but there's all these nuances in terms of whether you're actually incarcerated versus you're on home arrest versus you're on probation or parole. It gets really complicated pretty quickly. And so we just do it those on a case-by-case basis when they do arise. Children, I like to think of children kind of in two categories. Well, actually, say three categories. You sort of have, you have 0 through 6. Those are generally more difficult people to work with, or populations to work with, just because there's the issue of whether, more of a scientific question that comes up over and over again, can you really get information from infants that is going to be meaningful in any way, shape, or form? In other words, do they have the cognitive capacity to really give you the information that you're looking for in any kind of meaningful way? And that's a question that comes up over and over again. I would say the only time the IRB really steps in from like a scientific review standpoint, I mean, it just happened in other cases, but children's comes up so often, is like that 0 to 6, 0 to 5. It's really, it's really gets more scrutiny, I have to say. I've seen them get approved, just asking for much more documentation, and sometimes we've had to consult experts. In a second category, I'd say 7 to 12. Easier because it's about elementary school age, or it is elementary school age. Question really in there is are the questions appropriate? Again, are the children going to be able to understand them? And so on and so forth, and also what the context is. Doing it in a classroom as opposed to outside the classroom, that always creates an interesting thing too, whether you're even coming in as a support provider, you're the teacher. Those are can be more tricky things to navigate. Not impossible, just interesting. Then we have our last group, so we'd have 13 to 17, where I'm, solidly late middle school, high school. Interesting thing, always has arisen in a lot of other schools I've worked at, where I've worked with a lot of education students, is that when students turn 18, which is generally sometime within senior year, they switch from being a child to being an adult. And so a lot of times I've seen researchers wait literally to, like, say, the second semester of senior year if they were going after, if their population was high school students, just because they don't need to get parental permission. And so that's the other piece of it too, with children, is that they also need parental permission. So, for example, I've seen instances where the parent agrees, but then the child doesn't. And so you need both sides there. Now, if the parent or guardian didn't agree, then, but the child does agree, there's certain circumstances there where we could, work through that, but generally speaking, you need permission on both sides. Comatose patients, obvious, they can't consent. Cognitively impaired, I would say, I would add to this also people with medical conditions or psychiatric conditions, more difficult to study, especially even in an inpatient or possibly outpatient setting, just because we have to ask the question, do they really understand what they're consenting to? And then the second half of that is where is that information going? How is it going to be stored? And then kind of issues of, whether the data is going to be identifiable or not. So really interesting questions. I threw one more in there because we're in an educational setting as employees and students, not definitively outlined as like you must give more consideration to this, but employees and students are interesting because even if students are over age of majority, so they'd be 17, there's some freshmen when they enter college or not. Well, we do assume in like a college setting that all students are adults, even if they're haven't necessarily officially turned 18, maybe that first semester. We still view them as adults within the contextual setting of that. There's a power differential, and we just want to make sure that we also know that they know what they're participating in. There's no issues of coercion. Okay, so other quasi-vulnerable, well, I call them quasi-vulnerable populations, or populations we really look out for, non-English speaking or undocumented. Pretty simple. I mean, we, of course, with everything that's going on in 2026, I think that no one needs to say more about that. It's not that you can't do it, it's just that we need to kind of think a little bit more about kind of how we're going to protect them. Employees, I just mentioned, this happens a lot in organizations, and I've always been amazed by this, is where, someone senior in the organization will send around a survey, generally assessing organizational health or whatever, effectiveness, and the people that are sending it around, let's just say it's a dean's office, but could be anybody in senior administration, they know exactly who's answering it, because they are tracking it. I mean, that's just completely unethical, just from I'm not talking from a research IRB perspective here, just talking from an ethics perspective. I mean, like, you're just setting people up. And this happens so often in school districts, especially when there's the threat of layoffs and they're trying to figure out how to get rid of people, and everybody's been there for a certain period of time. So it's not like first in, first out type of thing, but you really want to get rid of the people who are sort of dissenting within the organization. I've seen this so much in other schools I've worked at, where I would have principals and administrators come in and say, well, I can get this information just because they have to. And it's like, yeah, they maybe, I mean, but like, that's also coercive too. And just completely unethical. It just goes to sort of the motivation sometimes and the reasons why we have, IRB and ethical review process in place. Third one, I'd say true threat to anonymity. This is my best example of this always is the elementary school where, in elementary school, for the most part, we know this that like 80% or more of elementary school teachers are female. In some cases, it's like 95%. And so if you were going to do a one-time survey where it really truly was anonymous, but you were asking demographic questions, and the demographic questions were favored to, and fill in the blank what your homogeneous population is going to be, in there, 95% and you have 5% heterogeneous, so you have kind of 5% outliers. In that situation, I always explain that I think the demographic profile actually does give away who the 5% of the population is that's answering those questions. So you could be able to figure out who they were. So in those cases, we have to truly think, is this really anonymous, even though it's one time? Or do our demographic variables, which generally don't reveal a person's identity, but in a situation where you have a large homogeneous population and then a smaller heterogeneous population, we have to think about that. Data collected about individuals may reasonably cause harm. This really more is an issue now these days with social media and stuff like that. One of the biggest things that are listed or most common things listed in social behavioral applications sent on to Brainy is that, or just in general, is what are the risks to potential subjects? And so we sort of think about them in four different categories that kind of fall along, kind of a history or historical framework. Political being, is the study taking place in a context where there is, where the answers to these questions could be political and lead to someone's job loss. Economic, obviously kind of correlating with the first one, if the answering these questions could potentially interfere with someone's professional ability to make money or within their context, that's important. Social and cultural are kind of obvious as well. Again, you don't want to collect data about someone that's going to reasonably cause harm, especially if these people could be identifiable in when your study gets published. And let's put it this way. Even dissertations, everything gets out there. Even dissertations get published to ProQuest or digital dissertations, or even sometimes master's theses if schools have those, are requiring those to be dumped in there. Really get out in Google and within, I like to say 5 minutes. And maybe it's not like just literally typing it into Google, but it's Google Scholar, or it's you can use the AI to pull things up. It's just so much easier these days to get access to pretty much anything. So I like to say anything, any kind of research that's done that you're publishing in any kind of front-facing manner. Most people, let's face it, 99% of the population is probably not going to care about your research. And that's not a judgment or a good or bad thing. But in controversial situations, it's easy enough for someone to go in there and try to dig something up on people if they really wanted to. And just power relationships. I think the best example of this is supervisor, supervisee, or supervisor and employee. Obviously, in those situations, there's a power dynamic there, and asking someone to do something just like, that's going to put them in some kind of vulnerable position. I think is objectively unethical. And so we have to think about that sometimes when research is being done. So recruitment practices these days have really changed than what they were 10 years ago, especially with the advent of social media. And so I think the most important thing here is not so much the sampling mechanism of how you're going to necessarily get your participants. So there are some idiosyncratic rules about social media and stuff like that, which really goes to the level of privacy you have on there, but it's really kind of a totally separate conversation because it gets really esoteric. And if you're not using social media, I don't want to bore you. But really, these days, it's really the most important thing with recruitment, much like it was like 10 years ago, where you used to ask for, I just need to see the literal narrative you're sending out to people, because the big thing back then was like flyers or emails. Now it's really just seeing the posting. So what does the posting look like you're going to put on Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok or Facebook? So it's really just seeing what that is to make sure it's not coercive or misleading. In terms of the research design, this comes up a lot, and I see this across the board from both faculty, students, and staff. It's kind of all the same. We're not here to critique your research design. Um, in most cases, I would say in some cases where you're doing stuff that truly is on the fringes. Um, More what we're looking for is not so much that to critique what it is you're doing, just to make sure it's been done previously. As I tell students all the time, especially, there's really no ideas out there that are completely brand new. What there are is in research is you're taking, what's existing knowledge out there and adding a little piece, a drop in the sort of if you think about knowledge as being this great database, we're adding a little piece of it. And so in some cases where the research is truly on the fringes or something that's more controversial, the most important thing I think for us to see is just grounded in something. We just want to know that you haven't made it up. So give us some references to previous studies that have been done and show how your study is not necessarily 100% replication, but say 90% replication or 80% replication. That this has really been done before, and we need to make this up in order to potentially take advantage of people or for whatever sinister reasons or whatever. That's really what we're looking at. From a more practical perspective, the other piece we're looking at too is just that you have a clear sense of what it is you're doing. So you know what your problem statement is. You have clear research questions. Your research questions parallel what you're asking in your interview and survey guides. And we're not going into a deep examination of whether you should have asked a question like this or like that. It's more just, logically, does this all make sense? Like it's like reading a book. Is there sort of a narrative from A to Z that you can clearly see on a very high level throughout? Just examining surveys and interview guides, again, just to make sure the questions aren't, you know, you're saying one thing and doing another, or they're not overtly coercive in some way, shape, or form. And we're also looking at the cost benefit analysis here. And like in more complicated studies and studies certainly on the fringes of, are pioneering or cutting edge. And fringes is not necessarily a negative term, it's just calling it kind of what it is. We're constantly trying to make sure the cost benefit analysis is remaining within that 51-49 paradigm that the subjects are less likely to get hurt in this study than more likely. And if we deem that there is a potential likelihood of harm, we figure out a way to mitigate that. And that can be done in most cases. So I'd like to give a big overview here of kind of some problematic research designs that have been out there. Deception studies are really hard to do. Prisoner studies, as I mentioned. In civil society, I should say, there's no expectation of privacy. So there's an expectation of privacy in your apartment, but not Starbucks, possibly your car. You don't have any First Amendment rights at airports, and so filming in airports would be challenging. Courts, so on and so forth. Also, one places of employment is generally a little bit dicey. Even the student that was going into this high-end retail store in New York City, I told them, make sure management knows or you've gotten approval from someone that you're doing sort of a quasi-ethnographic study here just to understand consumer buying habits. Because this idea of kind of like private and public becomes pretty blurred when we think about that. So places of employment, one's car, one's home, we know those are restricted access. When we start thinking about like the mall or Starbucks, definitely open. Definitely your privacy expectations are almost down to zero out there with, some idiosyncratic, things going a little bit one way as opposed to another. Social media is really interesting too, because as much as we tell people in social media only to use, the best way of doing it is the person has to have a publicly facing profile, meaning anybody can see their content on there and not restricted. It's not always that's not always an easy standard to say all the time because people do switch and stuff is dynamic and stuff like that. Or some things are public, some things are private. I'm no social media expert, but I do say that social media accounts definitely are fair game. And I basically tell people If you don't want people to see what you put on Facebook, make it private. That's really sort of the basic analogy I would sort of say there. It gets really complicated with social media, but like anything, just know what you're posting. Okay, so the last big pieces I'm going to talk about here is privacy and confidentiality. So privacy we think about is like the what is being afforded to you in society. So it's a person or individual as opposed to like document or data. When we think about confidentiality, we think about data that we're keeping and we're using in more of a local context. Um, Moving on to the next thing. So there's four kinds of data privacy once we get past the idea of what is privacy and what is confidential. And I would say the number one, I say this all the time. I'm always amazed by this, and I think part of it is the press does a really bad job, confusing us with this. Anonymous data is really data that it's no better than confidential or coded data. Let's start out by saying that. Anonymous data is really one-time survey. The demographic information you're collecting in there is not going to reveal who the participants are, as I talked about in my elementary school study. My elementary school example. And it's collected one time, no intention to use it in the future in any way where the participants' identities would be revealed. You're not going to do cross validation through an interview, through interviews or focus group or fill in the blank, whatever else. It's one time. So you don't know who the participants are. So what I love in the media, they'll talk about these anonymous sources. It's like, there are no anonymous sources anymore these days. This is the 1970s where, you could call from a payphone and no one would know who you are. That those days are over with. And this drives me crazy when I hear about this. And they use this all the time in Washington, D.C. context. They know who the source is. They're just not revealing them. It's not like someone calls from a payphone around the corner and they have no idea. They're using confidential sources. So to bring that into the difference between anonymity and confidentiality, you're actually coding the information. You know who the participants are, but you're choosing not to reveal their information. Just like people in the press choose not to reveal who their sources are. They know damn well who they are. And so that's really important. So I get this all the time, especially in qualitative research. You can't have you can't have anonymous data. You know who the people are. They're sitting across from you. What you can do, though, is to code their identities or use what's commonly called pseudonyms to call Jack, Jerry, Mary, Barbara, fill in the blank, whatever, participant one, participant two, participant A, participant B, come up with these other wacky things. There's so many different ways to do it, but you're actually, in essence, not revealing who the individual person is. There's reasons why you would want to reveal the person's name, and there's reasons why you wouldn't want to reveal the person's name. It really kind of gets specific to each study. Coded data, I just think of as a secondary data. So there's two forms of secondary data. There's ones that you would get from a large data set, and most of the time there's no identifiers in there. So we're talking about, thousands of names in there. Maybe someone has a code to link them back, but they're not giving it to you, and it's pretty obvious that this is just, you got an Excel sheet with, 10,000 data points in there, and you don't even care who the participants, the information is. And then another form of coded data too could be data that's or research that's already been collected. So if we do a study today and we publish it, let's say 6 months from now, and we want to go back and do a part two of that, the data we've collected now becomes, in essence, secondary data. So it may not be coded as in a large data set, but it exists. And if the identifiers were stripped from it, meaning that there weren't direct, Jerry was Jerry, Mary was Mary, it's a form of secondary data and it's a form of coded data in that sense, because any data that's collected yesterday is existing data or secondary data, whereas data collected tomorrow, prospective data. So it gets a little nuanced in there, but certainly I think most people are pretty much sitting within number two. Then there's identifiable data. This is an old example, but I think it's a good one. One of my students, about 10 years ago, I guess now, interviewed Marissa Meyer from Facebook. At that time, she was the only female in that particular role in text. There was no way to hide Marissa Meyer's identity. We knew who she was. And so, in certain contexts, especially when you're dealing with public officials, people that are, say, maybe union leaders in a local context, there's no way to hide these people's, who they are. So it's fine as long as the person agrees that, look, there's no way, even if I wanted to code your data, you're a famous person within this context that if anybody did a Google search, did an AI search, could figure out who you are within 3 seconds. That may even be long. And so we have to figure out a way. Basically, the balancing act here is if you don't want to go on the record with me, maybe it's not a good idea I include you in the study because there's no way I'm going to be able to say not attribute this to you. And the other piece of that is I think too are people who are sort of like everybody has a distinct communication style, but also people that are loudmouths that have sort of in whatever context it is, sort of maybe fringe or outlandish ideas, whether good, bad, or indifferent. Those people are also easily identifiable. So then we have to ask the question at the end of the day, as the researcher, and again, it's kind of on the ground, type question. Is having this person participate going to harm them based upon what they're saying to me? So it's a game time decision, but as you can see, it's sort of one of those, it's a very existential type decision. Um, Elements of informed consent, I'm not going to go through these, but you must use, it is a requirement that you don't make up your consent form. You must use ours. So it's either internally, if it's a non-human subject study, we have, New School has created ones. But if you're going to Brainy, which I said about 90% of the studies, they have their own consent forms. You're basically just filling in the different sections. And there's a reason for that because consent forms must have certain elements in order for them to hold up. I often tell people or often challenge people that your consent forms, the definition of consent form out in society, not in a research setting, is always very interesting. So I always say, after you write your own first form, informed consent, or maybe second or third, in a research setting, in a research in a university setting, doesn't have to be a research one, could be anything, could be like us, a research too. Next time you go to the doctor and their informed consent is very different than one you created. It's very interesting. Those informed consents at doctors' offices are always very interesting in terms of how much stuff they leave out. And in doctors' offices, you're dealing with HIPAA, so that's a whole nother can of worms that you have to sign off on too. It's always amazing to me. The ones that are real model operations, I think, are when you're going to hospitals or providers that are associated within a hospital network. Those are much closer to what the standard in the industry should be than when you're going to like someone who's just in a one-off or in a practice. It's just interesting. Doing this for so many years, I always find that's always the funnest part of reading those documents. How we think of approval criteria, I've mentioned this throughout. We're just looking for risks are minimized. There's a reasonable risk to benefit ratio, meaning there's some benefit to society, not necessarily a benefit to participants. As I mentioned earlier, there's probably more risk of something going wrong, even though that risk is probably at 1 or 2% these days, and there actually is a benefit to the participant. And so I get a lot of times people will say, well, by participating in this study, they're going to learn all about themselves. Yeah, they might, but likely not. And so that's a kind of like one of those things we just sort of have to accept when writing it. Equitable subject selection, meaning just that you're not harming one group as opposed to another. Obtaining consent is really important in that there's data monitoring and assessments for safety. And more what I mean by that is that the data is being stored in properly, and if there is a breach, you're letting us know. Because these days I feel like I get a email about a class action lawsuit or a data breach from someone once a week. So that is more of a reality, I think, than more something going wrong. Privacy and confidentiality safeguards I just talked about, and then just looking at if there's any additional protections we need to think about for vulnerable populations. So I always like to say, when you're doing this, consider the following. Is your study involving vulnerable subjects, identifiable data? International research poses a whole different set of questions, really just come down to the question of when, in the context in which you're going to in a different setting, and cultural expectations vary tremendously across the United States and even more so around the world. There could be a dominant population in a certain country that you're looking at, but then you could be dealing with a subpopulation. And really, what we're looking at there is that you're being culturally sensitive and culturally appropriate. And that's really it. But that is an interesting, very nuanced situation in international research. Cultural language issues, I would just say that one of the important things is translating consent forms from English to whatever the language is of the participants, or even saying to us, Kevin, or even saying to Sarah or Brainy, look, the consent forms are written like a 10th to 12th grade level, but my population is like 8th grade. Great. Let's figure out a way to dumb them down then but still keeping all of the language in there. And so dumbing them down in essence is just trying to make them more simple. How can we say the same thing instead of saying in an academic mumbo jumbo, we can say it that someone in the 8th grade reading level would be able to understand and truly comprehend, not just yes, yes, I agree, this is fine. Really get a sense of what it is on a very basic level. And I think that's like forces researchers. I know myself, I oftentimes, often find from doing this work, I'm asking people all the time, can you define your terms or define what that means? What you're thinking is maybe what I'm thinking, what you're thinking are two different things. So I think it's just making your research just accessible, not even the final product, which is getting out there and doing it. Protecting confidentiality data. This is just data storage. We do recommend in almost all cases that you're keeping it on the Google Drive within New School. If your data is more sensitive than that, we can give you a secured Google Drive that's even more secure. But reality is, you probably are keeping it on your phone to do the recordings, and you're going to transfer it somewhere else. So really using stuff that's dual factor authentication, we do recommend for example, for transcription services, because now you don't have to do it anymore yourself. AI can basically do it for you. Things like Otter AI, Zoom, Trint, Google Meet, I think is the one through Google. All those can provide again, 51-49% balancing accuracy are a little better than not. If you're dealing with an international population, I have heard from some of our students in Milano that Microsoft is very good for that. They have a translation service, I guess, that's more accessible in other languages. I would imagine Otter AI, if they haven't, they're probably moving in that direction too. They're sort of one of the big players out there. Maybe missing out on a significant portion of the population if it was just like English and Spanish. But to be continued there. And just making sure the risks of subjects are minimized. So if you were to submit an application to Brainy, which is simply their website, you no longer actually need to request an account to be created for Brainy. You can actually do it yourself. I didn't put the link in here, but it's on our website in Guru, brainy.myrbmanager.com. I'll make sure I put it in here next time. You link out to that. You upload you're uploading to Brainy, you're uploading all this stuff in their website, and their application is pretty user friendly. You'll be completing the Brainy application inside there. I think it's 26 or so questions. In social behavioral, there's probably 7 or 8 questions. If it's truly social behavioral study, it's not kind of like a mixed crossover. Sometimes we get that in psych. I would say it's really only 18 questions because some of them are just simply NA. You have your recruitment script. You've done your consent forms. You also have an updated city certificate, either from the new school or from another school if you've done it somewhere else. Our standard is it does expire within 3 years. So if you have it from someplace, the renewal course is definitely a little less painful than doing the original 18 modules where you need to have an 80% or better. Definitely does take about 1.5 to 2 hours at the very least. So that's another important thing. And then our other thing we've implemented a couple of years ago is just the answer review form, just asking basically, is it funded, international research, is it sensitive data, is it PII, is it FERPA, a couple things like that. It's pretty simple, and that is pretty much it. I'm going to leave up here the general inbox and then my information. I realize we're at 12:57, so I finished in time with 3 minutes to go. I always tell people, Yeah, no worries. You can have the HRPP box. That's my general departmental inbox. But if you have a question, just reach out to me directly. It's easy enough to forget to look at that inbox, daily. Sometimes I find I'm probably looking at it every other day. And I just tell people, if you have a question, just hit me up directly. No question's a bad question. Happy to come to classes. Um, do more tailored presentations, which I've done that before. I've talked to grad students before. So any different types of things. This is a very general overview and not really going into too much specifics in any area. But happy to go to classes, workshops, research methods classes, individual consultations, whatever makes the most sense for you. But no questions a bad question. So feel free to always reach out. Always here. And I actually I've been doing this for much longer than I want to admit. But I've seen a lot out there, and there's never a bad question. In fact, I oftentimes walk away at the end of the day thinking, I have no idea. I got to think about that one and come back on that one tomorrow because it's a really good question. So it just illustrates the kind of questions I get. I have to often think about. Okay, that's it.